Hello folks, the war within has seen the return of engineering mounts. This time the Crowd Pummeler 230. Like previous engineering mounts, this is a tradable mount which gives engineers a rare chance to make some decent gold from their profession. However, this mount has a bit of a big catch. The materials for this mount can be obtained from a vendor, Paxton Bombshell in the Ringing Deeps, for 3 million gold. So first glance, this looks like it's also the return of a major gold sink mount. And if you were going to craft the mount using the vendor parts, that's certainly what it would be. But the good news is there are other ways to get the mount, which turns out to be a lot cheaper. So let's dive in and see if we can get that cost down a bit. If we call just crafting it from the vendor parts method 1, then that takes us to method number 2, which is to buy it off the auction house, where in the EU, at the time I recorded this video, it would set you back only 2 million, which is a bit odd at first glance. If it costs 3 million to make, why on earth would engineers be willing to sell it for what is a 1 million gold loss? This is explained by method number 3, which is to buy the parts off the auction house. At the time of recording, buying all the parts in the auction house would set you back about 1.8 million, but I've seen that go as low as 1.5. which is still pretty eye-watering, but it's a lot better than 3 million. But why are folks selling these parts in the auction house for about half the vendor costs? This takes us to method number 4. As you probably guessed by now, there is another way to get those parts. This is using a brand new system for engineering called Pilfering. Now, before I go any further, if you do want the mount and money is no object, the pass of least resistance is to just buy it off the auction house. But if you want to save rather a lot of gold, then you're going to want to craft it yourself, which even if you just get the parts off the auction house will require picking up engineering. But that might be a little bit boring, so let's dive into how we can create the mount using the new pilfering system. For this guide, I'm going to assume that you're starting your engineer from scratch, but if you already have engineering leveled up in a character that you can use, I will put some time codes in the bar below so that you can skip past this initial bit. In order to get going, we're going to need to unlock the first engineering specialization, which does require getting to level 25. The good news is that once you get there, we can pretty much level up the rest of engineering just using the pilfering system. You can start out by heading into the big building in the center of Dornagal and talking to Thermoseo Arhidis. If you had engineering while leveling up, you will have a bunch of piles of rusted scrap which drop from NPCs all around Kazalgar. If not, then you are going to want to get hold of 25 of those. They are soulbound, so you will have to go and grind them off those mobs. Once you do, simply use Scour Through Scrap to break them down. This should get you to level 5 and unlock the Pilfer Through Parts ability from the engineering trainer. Now, what you want to do is to get your hands on Seraphite bolts. Now, I personally recommend learning Dragonflight Engineering, getting about 3.5k Seraphite ore and mass crafting it into bolts. Failing that, you can get around 1750 bolts from the auction house. Don't worry, you're not going to need all of these to get to level 25. And now comes the first part of the grind. What you want to do is to use the Pilfer Through Parts ability on those Seraphite bolts and break them down into piles of rusty scrap. You can then use the Scour Through Scrap ability in those. I recommend doing this in batches of maybe 100 at a time. Once you hit 25, you're going to want to learn inventing. And once you've learned inventing, you want to start to put any knowledge points that you earn into the inventing node until you unlock another node, and then select and start putting points into Scrapper. Once we have unlocked inventing, it's now time to start fishing for this Crowd Pummeler recipes. First of all, what you want to do is to use your new invent ability. This has roughly a 1-day cooldown, but will give you a prototype. I'll explain what to do with that in a moment. Once your invent is on cooldown, you can now go back to Pilfer Through Parts and Scour Through Scrap, doing this again in batches. What will now change is that you'll start to get some prototypes from that as well. Once you get a prototype, if you want to learn that particular recipe, then you can just use the prototype. Otherwise, you'll want to use the Disassemble Invention ability, which will give you some hastily scrawled notes. 15 of those can turn into a comprehensively organized idea. Using this will give you a pop-up with a choice of 3 recipes. When you get that pop-up, check to see if the Pummeler recipe is there. If it's not, then just select one of the other options. The more options you select, the more likely it will become that the Pummeler will eventually show up. There is fortunately a finite number of recipes you can learn, so it is eventually inevitable that you will get the Pummeler's recipe. Now that you've got the Pummeler's recipe, you can head over to the auction house if you want and just get the parts to get them out. If you do that, do double check the parts cost against the cost from the vendor. Occasionally, one or two of the parts will be dearer on the auction house than on the vendor, so don't end up ripping yourself off. But if you'd prefer to grind out the parts themselves, then as you've been working and getting that recipe, you will likely have got yourself a bunch of bountiful bolts, one of the parts for the Pummeler already, and this is a clue in how you'll get the rest of the parts. As it turns out, the Pilfer Through Parts ability has a chance of giving you all of the parts for the mount. Now, pilfering through bolts sadly will only give you the bountiful bolts. If you want to get the other parts, you're going to have to pilfer through some more complex and therefore more expensive parts. It appears that the more complex the part, the better the results, with some of the best parts including the Entropy Enhancer and Chaos Circuit from War Within Engineering. Those parts though are pretty expensive, and it's very unlikely in my view that if you use those you'll be able to beat the auction house prices for the Pummeler's parts. There are though a lot of alternatives, as you can see from the list of available parts that you can use Pilfer on. Other items which seem to have a lot of success include the thorium widgets and greased up gears and shock spring coils. These are all from older expansions and they are quite a bit cheaper to get the parts. This process is highly RNG. There is no guarantee that you will get the parts that you need for less than the auction house costs, but you will likely get a fair bit of excess parts that you don't need, and you can always sell those to hopefully make a bit more gold back. It is also going to take up quite a bit of our time. If you're just buying the parts off the auction house, then you can expect to spend a couple of hours in this. But if you were wanting to go out and say mine out the original raw materials and make the parts yourself, well, I saw a player in Wowhead who reported it took them 40 hours to get all of that. So is this going to be worth it? I personally spent around 1 million gold on thorium widgets and entropy enhancers for pilfering, along with another 500,000 gold in just purchasing parts. This took me to 1.5 million gold, approximately a 200,000 gold saving in just buying all the parts off the auction house. I also ended up with another 300,000 gold of parts and materials to sell, so it's closer to 500,000 gold saved once I eventually sell those parts. However, I was lucky enough to get a pummel permit from the pilfering. As the most expensive part, it's also the rarest to get from pilfering, and I've seen reports of people pilfering twice as many parts as I did and not get it. Currently, that's costing 700k in the auction house, although it does drop to around 500k at times. Which means that if that had not dropped for me, I would likely have ended up spending around 200k gold more than would have been the case just buying the part. What this shows is that choosing to go down the route of pilfering the parts for yourself is a bit of a gamble. If you're lucky like I was, you can save an awful lot of gold, but if you're not lucky, then it's going to cost you dear. My own personal advice is that if you have a lot of gold and enjoy losing as much as you do winning, this is probably a pretty fun way to get the mount. But if 1.5 to 2 million gold is a lot for you and you prefer to play safe, then the best way is to get the recipe from the mount and then just buy the parts from either the auction house or the vendor, depending on what's the cheapest at the time. If you do decide to buy the parts from the auction house, it is worth monitoring the prices for a couple of weeks to try and avoid buying when the prices are at the peak, as the overall cost of those parts can vary by as much as 250,000 gold from day to day. Either way, I hope that this guide will help you get the Crowd Pummeler for a bit less gold than that auction house price. And I'm really interested to hear about your success stories or not so success stories. Did you try pilfering, and if so, what did you find worked the best? Let us all know in the comments down below. I'm in the final push to 1,000 subscribers, a very important milestone for any YouTube channel, and if you've not subscribed already, it would mean the world to me if you hit that button right now. Your support will help me to continue to make my guides, news updates, and sometimes a very opinionated rants. And if you want to see more videos like this, then do please hit that like icon to let me and the YouTube algorithm know that I'm on the right track. That's all for now. Thanks for watching.